Hoople's cat. Influenza should strike terror into your heart, strikes terror into mine. So I had personal experience with SARS. Both me and Kitty were nursing in ICU in Toronto and nursed SARS patients. I nursed 43 or 44, I can't remember now. And it was a very odd time. It was 6 months in 2003 where we were very much personally impacted. But as a killing pandemic, SARS was pretty feeble. Very few people actually died. So in the 20th century there's been three major flu outbreaks, which are pandemics. A pandemic is an epidemic of an influenza virus that affects the entire globe and also infects a large proportion of the world population. The other thing with that is you have to bear in mind that it has to actually transmit from human to human for it to truly be classified as a pandemic. So the three major pandemics just should be named after their presumed site of origin, which isn't exactly true. 1918, the Spanish flu is the one everybody talks about. It killed probably over 50 million people worldwide and almost 750,000 people in the United States of America alone. Bearing in mind population was a lot smaller. The 1957 outbreak killed quite a few people, and that was called the Asian flu. And in 1968 we had the Hong Kong flu. And I would in fact add SARS to the list, but SARS was in the 21st century, even though there wasn't a huge number of deaths. It certainly gave people the impression that we could again die on large numbers from flu, but at the same time it also falsely gave people the impression that flu pandemics can be dealt with and won't cause the sort of havoc that occurred in 1918, 1957 and 1968. I don't think that's exactly true. People did die in SARS in 2003. I just want to pay respects to those people. They died in the line of duty. I would point out that most of us nurses and doctors and types like that, we don't actually expect to die from our jobs. So when we're confronted with the risk of actual death in our job, it's a scary thing. There was absences, but not huge amounts. There were retirements during SARS, and again, it wasn't killing a lot of people. I do foresee if there is a pandemic that is killing a large amount of people, I do foresee a lot of retirements and a lot of absences in healthcare. So I'm now going to switch to this book, which I've read and thoroughly enjoyed. It's about Winnipeg, which is one of the major cities in Canada at the time in 1918. And it still is a major city, but it's nowhere near as important economically or geographically or population as it was in 1918. And I'm going to go through this for you and talk about a few things and put up some pictures because I'm kind of boring to look at. Talk about death rate. What we talk about is the death rate of people in the First World. The 1918 Spanish flu, there approximately 50 million people died worldwide. In Canada, about 55,000 died, and many times that were actually infected. So it wasn't you got it and died. In Winnipeg, over 1,200 people died out of a population of about 180,000. So in terms of killing amounts, it statistically was very obvious that the death rate had risen. In terms of the population, it was very obvious to them that the death rate was there and was definitely risen. But in terms of the actual number of people who died, people who had goodish homes, people who had reasonable basic health care, good sort of nutrition going into it, was pretty good. But I think one of the important things that's unknown is that a large number of the Inuit and First Nations villages in Canada were almost entirely depopulated by this. The influenza hit them, they were already malnourished, and it spread literally like wildfire and actually killed a lot of them. And most of them died from the complications of the flu, which were respiratory pneumonia and respiratory edema. So you couldn't actually oxygenate yourself, and so you just slip into sleep and die. So it started at the big harbour, Sydney in Nova Scotia, and spread across Canada westwards, and about 5 deaths happened in Nova Scotia on the 30th of September, which is the date actually the first case was actually noted in Winnipeg. With modern transportation airlines, the spread would be very much faster, and it would not be exactly a wave spread, it would be a hub spread from major city to major city, which is exactly what we saw with SARS. Mexico City, Toronto, London, Berlin, Hong Kong, Shanghai. We saw people travel by airlines and then infect other people. First Nations areas is called Norway House, and they lost about 18% of their population. So rather than losing 1%, populations who are malnourished already and already in overcrowded conditions without access to good fresh water and stuff like that in the winter, in Canada that's going to be very likely for almost everybody in Grid Down, they're losing about 18% as opposed to about 1 to 1.2% of the population. So that's something to bear in mind in an SHTF event, is that you will need to take some planning on board for pandemic after an SHTF, right? So as a prepper, the prepping we do doesn't stop with the major event that causes the collapse of society if one actually occurs. There will be other SHTFs ongoing and also appearing after the major SHTF event. So one of the things I think will be changed now is that at the time in Winnipeg, most of the nursing care, the volunteer nursing care, the volunteer feeding, was done by Canadian, Anglo-Canadian women who were ethnically superior in terms of social status and economic status. The Jewish quarter, they had their own volunteers, and the same with the Polish quarters and stuff like that. So help was very much restricted to religious and cultural lines, and I can see that maybe being a factor. Something you might want to think about if you are a minority in an area and a pandemic breaks out. You may find it difficult to access the volunteer care because you're not one of them. Now, men were largely fighting the war at this time. The war was still ongoing, though just about over the First World War. But even so, most of the care was done by women. The few men who did volunteer to give nursing care basically were driving people around in cars, and they were given no actual legitimacy for their healthcare role. Now, when this started in 1918, flu, much as it is now, was viewed by the world's population as a benign disease. Killed a few people, hardly any, mostly the old and the very sick or the very young and very weak. 1918 changed that, changed it dramatically. Now, it began in Winnipeg in September of 1918, and it actually was still present, killing people by the end of the spring of 1919. At the peak of the epidemic was the early November 1918, so the actual peak of the epidemic and the deaths occurred approximately 2 months after the first outbreaks occurred, and this is kind of typical of flu as well. There were actually nearly 700 new cases reported in early November, and many of those who died had also received no medical care. So I think that's another important factor. A lot of the people who died in Winnipeg of flu weren't actually classified in the caseload. This would or would not be the same in the first world now. Depending on how many are dying, we will probably have much more accurate figures. One of the things I want to talk about is waves. Flus come in waves: 1 wave, 2 wave, 3 waves, 4 waves, sometimes 5 waves. Spanish influenza came in 3 waves. SARS came in 2 waves officially, but I actually think it was 3 waves. SARS came hard, became less killing quite quickly, luckily, and then got progressively less and less killing in the 3 waves. Spanish flu was atypical. The first wave killed, but not dramatically. The second wave killed dramatically. The third wave kind of killed, but again, by that point it wasn't as dramatic as the second wave, so it was somewhat overlooked. This should lead you to a question. The question you should now have is, if I get mild flu in the first wave, would I be able to catch bad flu in the second wave from the same virus that's mutated somewhat and die? The answer is probably. For example, the Asian flu of 1957 was very similar in virus to the Hong Kong flu of 1968. The people who had flu in the Asian flu of 1957 who survived, most of them did, they actually retained resistance to the 1968 strain. So if you do get flu in the first wave of the pandemic, the chances of catching flu in the second wave are dramatically reduced. They're not zero though. One of the main differences between 1918 and 2018 is the fact that we can provide basic nursing care, keeping people hydrated as far as possible, keeping them warm, cleaning them. But we can also now provide antibiotics and IV therapy. So in the first world, the death rate would be expected to be low. So everybody in the pandemic planning is assuming this. But the truth is nobody actually knows what the death rate would be. It will be a range. It will be statistically higher than normal. For example, in a normal bad winter, approximately 8 to 10% of the population catch a version of cold flu, on average. And I'm not seeing any evidence, by the way, that the flu vaccination program en masse is doing anything about that, but who knows. But in a pandemic, you'll probably see 40 to 50% of the population catch the flu. So that's going to impact the economy, that's going to impact every aspect of life in society. Society is going to become very slow and even stop for a while because too many people are sick to maintain the normal functions of society. And that's the main threat that the governments in Canada and America and Britain have been staring at. The one thing they're not staring at is the fact that they may have a less virulent flu. You may only have 25% of the population. What about the death rate? If 50% of everybody that catches the flu dies, we now have 5% of the population dying if only 10% get the flu. So that's the key thing. Is it easily transmitted? SARS wasn't. Spanish flu was. Does it kill a large number of people that catch it? Spanish flu, no, it did not. It only killed approximately 5 to 10% of the people that got it in the first world at the time. But if it was killing higher rates than that, for example Black Death type rates, we'd be looking at an entirely different scenario than what we would be doing. You can ride a pandemic out, you'll be fine, but if a number of people die over a critical mass, the chance of society resuming normally is going to be very much reduced. Now the good news is that eventually enough time passes, whether it's a couple of months or a couple of years or a decade or more after the actual event, birth rates will rise, society will get going again, the economy will actually start to boom once the pandemic is finished. So Spanish flu was estimated 2 to 3% death rate for the people who were infected. So let's assume about a 50% infection rate. So let's assume we have 2% death rate from a 50% worldwide pandemic. So how many people would that be? Well, assuming there's 8 billion people in the world, 4 billion of them will get infected and 2% of them will die. 2% of 4 billion is a large number. So how many people would die in the United States? 1% of the population. So if the population is approximately whatever it is, call it 380 million in the United States, 1% of that is 38 million people. That, over a couple of months, will have a huge impact. And the death rate can be higher than 2%. Statistically and normally, with flu epidemics, the death rate is about 0.3 to 0.4. So what we're looking at here is try and protect yourself from regular flus and colds that you might get during the year. If it's a pandemic, try to make sensible precautions to quarantine yourself. Don't assume others will be quarantining themselves, because they won't be. And making sure that you've got enough supplies in the house or wherever you're going to be, not to have to go out and contact and talk to other people for a good period of months, because that's going to put you at risk. And obviously the higher the death rate, the more freaked out society is going to be. So Winnipeg actually kept good records. So the vast majority of people who got flu, Spanish flu in 1918, became mildly ill and recovered within a week or less. They had to take to their bed, but they kind of got well quite quickly. That was the vast majority who got the flu. However, some of them became infected and then died very quickly, sometimes within 24 hours. So from onset of the first symptoms to death was less than 24 hours. And of those, 20% of those people died after a few days because they died from secondary complications. Secondary complications, pneumonic complications like pneumonia and edema on the lungs, which we would have a go at treating now, probably not that successfully. So it was atypical. Flu normally is, flu pneumonia used to be called the old man's friend because it's how old people died. Now in the modern era, in Canada at least, we intubate people, put them on life support and try and prevent them from dying, and then guess what, they die anyway, but that's what we do now. So cool sponging, changing the sheets, trying to keep them hydrated, basic quarantining, hand washing, keeping your face covered so you're not actually inhaling the airborne virus, is a smart idea. People tried a whole bunch of other stuff like mustard leaves, plasters, poultices and cupping, which I'll get into. You guys would probably try stuff like silver colloid and claim it works. It won't, but you can try stuff like that. Jim Henson of the Muppets tried that with pneumonia and he died. Sometimes you actually need modern medicine. Now cupping, I would advise people to get involved in this. It's actually a type of physiotherapy. I'm not going to show it and demonstrate it, but certainly if you have pneumonic infection, bacterial infection secondary to the influenza of your lungs, to be able to turn people every hour and get them to cough, expectorate, and also to be able to vibrate in a specific way their lung tissue actually will help. And in my pandemic series I will actually show this, but it will be in a while because pandemic has to get better. So most people who died were the age of 20 to 40s. That's atypical. Usually in flus it's very, very young and the very, very old. Atypically, most of them that died were men. Men tended not to do as well as women for some bizarre reason, which we never quite found out. What did communities do? Now, remember they were involved, most communities were involved in the First World War. Quarantining was tried, placarding, which is when you put a sign on the door saying, don't go in, this person's infected. They weren't really done in North America that much, and they're the two things that tend to make a population angry. So that was actually a good thing not to do that. It didn't really do much anyway. During SARS in 2003, we put up biohazard signs on our house in the country, just for giggles. Nobody visited us anyway. And we had to walk the dogs with masks on in the country area and people would stare at us. So what did they do? Most of the communities actually didn't do too much quarantining outside of the hospital, which is a different issue. They tried to fumigate with pesticides all incoming trains and passengers and their luggage, and also public transportation. So subways, streetcars, buses, taxis would be regularly sprayed with pesticide during this sort of a period. They would urge people to wear masks. Of course, the community won't be urged to wear masks if there's a mask shortage, which is why you need to have lots of masks. Most of the cities in North America actually banned public gatherings. They closed schools, closed cinemas, closed theatres, closed girly clubs, and very often they didn't close down churches, though there were some attempts to that. But mostly when people started dying, most people did not voluntarily go into a large crowd. They urged people to get rest and plenty of fresh air, and you have to report it promptly to the physician group and stuff like that. And most of the measures were done without coercion, without force. And I think that's an important thing. And that's the technical way we're looking at it in 2018, is that we would impose restrictions but expect the peers of society to enforce them rather than have people arrested. Public corporation education is much preferable. It works far better than enforcement. There's an argument about the actual death rates, but this is kind of a reasonable one. In Canada, 6.1 people out of every 1,000 died by the flu. That's quite a staggering number, right? It's only 0.6 for every 100. So basically every 150 people you know die, right? The United States of America, they were slightly worse, and at 6.5%. Winnipeg actually was at 6.6%. Again, that reflects the immigrant population, the housing conditions, and also the larger proportion of First Nations in the area, because they don't have nice homes and good food and diet. Cameroon is estimated to have had 445 people die for every 1,000 people of their population. They pretty much lost 44.5% of their entire population. Western Samoa lost 236.1. Absolutely catastrophic in some areas of the world. Australia did the best out of everybody. They lost 2.7 for every 1,000, basically because they didn't let any boats land. They had a strict quarantine around their border. The flu is affecting about 50% of the population. It's killing about 0.6 out of every 1,000 people. That alone had large numbers of farm stock, livestock, starving to death in the fields because there was nobody to look after them. It was kind of extremely catastrophic. The other thing that I get from this and other stuff is that the rural population has about double the death rate of the urban population, and that reflects the inability of the rural population to provide good quality basic nursing care, free food and drinks being brought to people's homes when they can't leave. Something to think about. One of the things preppers need to do is network, and one of the things you need to do with your local neighbours is network enough that if you are laid up in bed for 2 weeks with flu, they'll actually come in, and they have a key, and they'll come in and they'll change your sheets and throw some water on you and give you some drinks. Networking on the local level for a pandemic that's killing a large number of people is absolutely critical. Again, so is quarantining, right? But if it fails, you need to have somebody to look after you. By October the 30th in Winnipeg, they had 13 deaths a day, and they were having nearly 300 new cases reported a day. Those numbers actually aren't catastrophic for a population's chance of survival and society's chance of survival, but those numbers would overwhelm Toronto, which is a city of 6 million. It was pretty bad. The response, same during SARS, was that the authorities attempt to calm both themselves and the population. They tell people that flu isn't dangerous unless you get the symptoms, they tell you to wash hands, they tell you to do this, they tell you to do that, and they try and give the impression that we have it under control, hope for the best, if something goes wrong we will look after you. So expect a lot of messages like that. I think one of the interesting things is Survivors, a show from the 1970s in England that they made a terrible remake of from the UK, and that had a death rate of over 99% of the population. It's kind of a fun old series, and I do recommend you watch that. It gets kind of daft later on. But the actual impact of a huge death rate, even if the death rate is 5% of the population, i.e. 5%, 1 in every 20 people die in a 2-month period, would psychologically be catastrophic trauma. I'm not talking about PTSD and safe zones, I'm talking about people aren't going to go to work, and they're going to be very frightened for a very long time. So they did get a vaccination program going in Winnipeg. Now we estimate 4 to 6 months for vaccination, for a vaccine, right, in a pandemic. Could be faster, could be longer, it depends. Now in Winnipeg, when they actually started the vaccination program, they had to use a lot of police. There was mass rioting and fighting to try and get the vaccine. Again, that's something you're going to have to be wary of. Going to get a vaccine, remember that if the death rate's high enough, there is very high likelihood that the vaccines that are offered will be salt water, maybe with some vitamins in it. They will do anything they can, the controlling elite, to make sure that the population doesn't just completely stop. Power has to run, sewer has to run, water has to run, some amounts of food have to get into the cities. Once they lose that control, they're in a big problem. So they will do whatever they can do to reassure the population to keep most of it functional. This is the key thing, and certainly the pandemic fictional series I'm doing is going to ape this, because it's what I've seen in every flu going. What you get is a period of time, days, weeks, usually weeks, of this was a new thing going on, this new disease, it's killing a few people, blah blah blah, and then you get a sudden explosion of case numbers, and that definitely happened with Spanish flu. So people were aware there was a flu, they weren't that bothered about it, and then suddenly in a period of 4 to 5 days, large percentage of the population went down with it, and some of them were dying. And I expect that to be the same in any pandemic. So the time to quarantine yourselves, if that's your plan, and that's my plan, is as soon as you think it's going to be a pandemic, not once people start dying in the town around you. The other thing is banning on public gatherings and stuff like that. So Winnipeg did the longest one in Spanish flu, it was 46 days, and once they lifted it, there was a huge rush from the population to go back to the theatres, to go back to the cinemas, very much focused on let's get back to normal. And that happened in Toronto after SARS in 2003. It's a very human reaction. What I would point out is that there may well be a third phase, and there was in Spanish flu, and I would restrict your exposure to other people for quite some time after the authorities are telling you it's fine, it's over. Don't necessarily trust the information that you are given. Winnipeg's great for that, it proves this point. So once the second wave had finished, which killed nearly 900 people, they actually scaled everything down. The volunteer food, the volunteer nursing, everything was really scaled down, and people rushed back to normal. So when the third wave hit, just before around about February of 1919, that actually killed 301 people. So it was about a third as fatal as the second wave, but the actual society had not left the things in place to cope with it. I think that's indicative as well. Don't just expect, I've survived this massive population drop due to flu, I'm going to be fine, it's gone forever, if I had it I'm fine, I'm immune. Expect a third wave. You may not see one, but expect it. Remember, waves are going to come every 6 to 8 weeks. First wave, 6 to 8 weeks. Second wave, 6 to 8 weeks. Third wave, 6 to 8 weeks. And there cannot be up to 4 or 5 waves, so that's not likely. And typically, one of the 3 or 2 or 4 waves will be the major killing one, but people will still die in the other waves. One of the interesting things is Winnipeg actually provided hospital beds, and they were very rarely full. I think that's an interesting thing. Most people that died in Winnipeg died at home. There was a huge distrust of the official healthcare system because mostly it was extremely poor charity or extremely rich healthcare system. So they actually needed thousands of beds, literally needed thousands of beds. People at one point, by the end of October, they would actually go into homes. They would force their way into homes that weren't responding, and they would find a man or his wife dead, the other one incapacitated in bed, children dead or dying or starving. And that's, I think, a really important thing to take note of here. Unless the pandemic's killing 99% of the population, we owe it to society to try and protect the loved ones and the neighbours around us. Don't just necessarily wall up and stay in there with your shotgun and shoot anybody that comes by. Society will resume. Society will become normalised again. And if you can and you have the equipment, you do need to have some sort of a communication from at a distance with your neighbours so you can alert the authorities if available, or you can maybe do something if able if one of the neighbours is incapacitated and the household is down. I think that's a really important thing. We are living social lives these days in islands. People do not know their neighbours' names. That's a critical weakness in 2018 in a pandemic. The majority of deaths were 20 to 39-year-olds, males more than women, less than 5%, but statistically there. Children did die as well. A couple of hundred children died during this as well. So your age did not protect you. It just made you less likely to die from it. And they think it's due to an autoimmune response. So the virus sets off there. It's a foreign body. The body tries to fight it. Cytokinase and blah blah blah. All these cascades start, and you actually get sepsis and die, mostly from respiratory. So that's the other thing as well. I think there is a place in this for good nutrition. I think things like turmeric and anti-inflammatories and good hydration and salts and sugars, all of the basic stuff's important. And I'm just going to do this as a two-parter. But when I had flu the last few weeks, I couldn't drink cold water, I couldn't drink anything. All I could do was tepid water. So I forced myself to drink probably about 2 to 3 litres of tepid water a day. And it was a struggle, but every time I woke up I forced myself to swallow some water, to drink it. You as the patient have to be aggressive with yourself. If you can't move around, don't worry about it. If you can't eat anything, don't worry about it. I went about 5.5 days eating literally nothing. Don't force Gatorade, don't force water on people if they're not able to drink it, but they have to be hydrated. Within 24 hours with a fever, and you should be taking the temperature, mine was 39.2 at the worst, you have to keep them hydrated whether they want to or not. So one of the things I would advise if you've got the capability is intravenous fluids. You don't need a lot of them, but an extra 1 litre a day for 2 or 3 days could make the difference between survival and non-survival. The other thing, of course, is antibiotics. Good, strong, broad spectrum ones that deal with bacterial infections. If they start to get congested, you can hear congestion by a stethoscope, or you can hear it because it's in their upper chest. Physiotherapy by cupping, positioning, hydration. Also, you might want to consider, once their sputum becomes thick and green or smelling, you might want to consider a broad spectrum antibiotic. And there are different presentations of pneumonia. And there are also different presentations of flu. I had respiratory flu for 3 days, which lasted 2 weeks, but by far the worst thing for me was GI flu. It actually was in my mid-transverse colon. I could feel it. for about 6 days, and I had literally explosive liquid diarrhea, and that was really difficult to deal with. And without Kitty giving me basic nursing care on a frequent basis, I would have survived. But I wouldn't have definitely survived if everybody else around me had flu. Anyway, toodles. Remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today. So if you don't prepare, it definitely will be. And think about what you're going to do, you and your family are going to do in a pandemic.